Cordials WSST, because local matters.
The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors have been proudly serving the people of this community since 1918. Service is our motto. The poor, the rich, the middle class and all are given the best of care and attention at all times. You have the privilege to select what you want. In your time of need, contact the capable, the competent, and the dependable staff of the J.W. Williams Funeral Home who is genuinely concerned with your care. At J.W. Williams Funeral Home, you are aptly served by the proprietor, president, Deacon Arthur L. Parker, who continues the traditions and values set forth by the past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams. Your announcements for the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Sunday morning program are Deacon Arthur L. Parker, Reverend Isaac H. Owens, Mrs. Calandra Wilkerson Parker, Minister Frankie Harmon, Miss Sandra Johnson, and Deacon Earl Clark, Jr.
Thank you, and good morning, friends. We come to you this morning to bring announcements, dedications, and songs. We certainly hope that your day may be brighter after listening to our program. The family of Deacon John Henry Hawkins of Rochelle, Georgia, the family of Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden of Cordell, Georgia, the family of Miss Viola Celestine Mathis of Vienna, Georgia, the family of Mr. Aldine Holmes of Americas, Georgia, the family of Mr. Monarchi Lorenzo Smith Sr. of Cordell, Georgia, the family of Mrs. Cora Lee Barner Robinson of Cordell, Georgia, the family of Mr. Olin James Walker of Cordell, Georgia, the family of Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr. of Leesburg, Georgia, the family of Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman of Cordell, Georgia, the family of Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow of Cordell, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida, the family of Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson of Cordell, Georgia, the family of gospel musician Brother Whitrow Wilson Bivens Jr. of Cordell, Georgia, would like to thank their many friends for the food, the flowers, the condolences, and all other expressions of sympathy and kindness shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. Deacon John Henry Hawkins, age 66, of 13252 Cannonville Road, Rochelle, Georgia, died Saturday, January 30th at Centennial Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. The funeral service for Deacon John Henry Hawkins, age 66, was held Sunday, February 7th, graveside at the Antioch Baptist Church Cemetery in Pineview, Georgia. His pastor, Dr. James Jamerson, pastor of the Antioch Baptist Church of Pineview, Georgia, officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Geraldine King Hawkins of Rochelle, Georgia. His loving and devoted children, Mr. John W. Hawkins and his wife, Mrs. Alea Hawkins, and Mr. Andre Hawkins and his wife, Mrs. Jennifer Hawkins, both of Americas, Georgia. Mrs. Elise Hawkins and her husband, Mr. Johnny Hawkins, and Mrs. Audrey Hawkins and her husband, Mr. Brenton Hawkins, both of Macon, Georgia. Mrs. Natasha Cooper and her husband, Mr. Darian Cooper of Americus, Georgia. One stepson, Mr. Tyrese King of Pineview, Georgia. 19 beloved grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren, a beloved sister, Mrs. Jimmy Richardson of Americus, Georgia, his beloved uncle, Mr. Louis Mays, and his wife, Mrs. Mary Mays of Abbeville, Georgia, his beloved sisters-in-law, Miss Pearl Jordan of Americus, Georgia, Miss Louise Mays of Dothan, Alabama, Miss Laverne Brown and her husband, Mr. Larry Brown, and Miss Aretha Singletary, both of Pineview, Georgia. His brothers-in-law, Mr. Leon King, and his wife, Mrs. Rebecca King of Ocilla, Georgia, and Mr. Marvin Singletary and his wife, Mrs. Lisa Singletary of Pineview, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends to include Mr. Joe Jones and Miss Bertha Hosley of Americus, Georgia, Mrs. Annie Moore of McRae, Georgia, Mrs. Barbara Stewart of Leslie, Georgia, and Mrs. Josephine Williams Lewis of Abbeville, Georgia, survived Deacon John Henry Hawkins, age 66, of 13252 Cannonville Road, Rochelle, Georgia. Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden, age 63, of 1605 Old Coney Circle, Cordell, Georgia, died Saturday, January 30th, at her residence in Cordell, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden was held Sunday, February 7th, graveside at the Forest Chapel Baptist Church Cemetery in Pinehurst, Georgia. Her pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, officiated. Survivors include her loving and devoted children, Miss Aisha Blackburn and Mr. Demetrius White, both of Cordell, Georgia. Her beloved stepchildren, Mrs. Felicia Campbell and her husband, Mr. Leroy Campbell, Mr. Antonio Mathis and Miss Latasha Mathis, both of Vienna, Georgia, Miss Shante Cobb of Doolin, Georgia, and Miss Tracy West of Unadilla, Georgia. 9 beloved grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, her beloved and devoted sibling, Mrs. Julia Walker, and her husband, Mr. Freddie Walker, and Mr. Larry McLeod, both of Cordell, Georgia, Mrs. Cynthia Thomas Hunter, and her husband, Mr. Eddie Hunter of Washington, D.C. A host of nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survived Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden, age 63, of 1605 Old Coney Circle, Cordell, Georgia. Miss Viola Celestine Mathis, age 72, of 400 South 7th Street, Vienna, Georgia, died Tuesday, February 2nd, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordell, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Viola Celestine Mathis, age 72, was held Monday, February 8th, graveside at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Her pastor, the Reverend Charles Cobb Sr., pastor of the Spring Hill Baptist Church of Tippettville, Georgia, officiated. Survivors include her loving and devoted daughters, Mrs. Avius Bolden and her husband, Deacon Carey Bolden, and Mrs. Loretta Cooper and her husband, Mr. Curtis Cooper, both of Vienna, Georgia. Her loving and caring grandchildren, Miss Latia Redding, Miss Kanisha Cooper, Mr. Martavius Bolden, Mr. Jartavius Bolden, Mrs. Kashika Bolden, and Mr. Kerry M. Bolden. 3 beloved great-grandchildren, a beloved and devoted sister, Miss Laverne Smith of Vienna, Georgia. Her beloved brothers, Mr. Kenneth Mathis and his wife, Mrs. Routine Mathis, and Mr. Larry Mathis, both of Vienna, Georgia. Her devoted companion, Mr. Milton Simpkin of Vienna, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Viola Celestine Mathis, age 72, of 400 South 7th Street, Vienna, Georgia. Mr. Aldine Holmes, age 47, of 207 Lorraine Avenue, Americus, Georgia, died Sunday, January 17, at the Phoebe Sumter Medical Center in Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Aldine Holmes, age 47, was held Monday, February 8, at the New Corinth Baptist Church Cemetery graveside in Leslie, Georgia. The Reverend George F. Muntz officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mrs. Shanika Holmes, Miss Mary Holmes, Miss Alexis Holmes, Miss Chastity Holmes, and Miss Jace Holmes, all of Americus, Georgia. 5 beloved grandchildren, his beloved godmother, Miss Ola Mae Lyles of Americus, Georgia. His beloved sisters, Miss Lizzie Gibson and her husband, Mr. Henry Gibson of Raleigh, North Carolina. Miss Stella May Love of Tallahassee, Florida. Miss Betty Foster and her husband, Mr. Bobby Foster. Miss Pranitha Mabel and Mrs. Dorothy Mabel and her husband, Mr. Donnie Mabel, all of Americus, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. William Houston of Leslie, Georgia, Mr. Ricardo Holmes, Mr. Willie Holmes, and Mr. Timothy Holmes, all of Americus, Georgia. His beloved aunts and uncles, Mr. Willie Bateman and his wife, Mrs. Jessie Bateman, Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, and her husband, Mr. James Hamilton, Mrs. Evelyn Asbury and her husband, Mr. Jimmy Asbury, Mrs. Georgia Johnson and her husband, Mr. Lawrence Johnson, Mrs. Patricia Bell and her husband, Mr. David Bell, Mrs. Johnny Lyles, Mr. Joe Lewis Mabel, and Mr. Johnny Mabel and his wife, Mrs. Patricia Mabel, all of Americus, Georgia. A host of other relatives and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Aldine Holmes, age 47, of 207 Lorraine Avenue, Americus, Georgia. Mr. Monarchi Lorenzo Smith Sr., age 58, of 412 West 21st Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, February 2nd at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Monarchi Lorenzo Smith Sr., age 58, was held Tuesday, February 9th at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Portico in Cordele, Georgia. His pastor, the Reverend Willie James Felton, pastor of the Mount Bethel Baptist Church, Pena Community, officiated. The burial followed at the Gibb Chapel Cemetery in Pena Community, Cordele, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Jacqueline Smith of Cordele, Georgia, his loving and devoted son, Mr. Voss French of Warner Robins, Georgia, Mr. Monarchie Smith Jr., and Mr. Francisco Smith and his wife, Mrs. Keisha Smith, both of Cordele, Georgia, 6 loving grandchildren, a beloved sister, Mrs. Betty McKenzie, and her husband, Mr. Marvin McKenzie of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved aunts and uncles, Mrs. Ethel Montfred and her husband, Deacon Edward Montfred, Deacon Harold Reese Sr. and his wife, Mrs. Helen Reese, Mr. Joseph Reese, and Mr. Elijah Reese, all of Cordele, Georgia. His sisters-in-law, Mrs. Patricia Sutton, and her husband, Mr. Percy Sutton of Killeen, Texas, Minister Cynthia Bryant of Tucker, Georgia, Miss Judy Faye Williams and her husband, Mr. Clarence Williams of Konya, Georgia, and Miss Regina Morgan and her husband, Mr. Charles Morgan of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved brothers-in-law, the Reverend Leonard Boston and his wife, Mrs. Lucille Boston of Vienna, Georgia, and Mr. Terry Boston of Cordele, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Monarchie Lorenzo Smith Sr., age 58, of 412 West 21st Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Cora Lee Barner Robinson, age 77, of 1108 South 8th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Tuesday, February 2nd, at the South Georgia Medical Center in Valdosta, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Cora Lee Barner Robinson, age 77, was held Wednesday, February 10, graveside at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Her beloved cousin, the Reverend Jeff Wilson, pastor of the Odom Grove Baptist Church, officiated. Survivors include a beloved stepson, Mr. Bernard Shivers of Newark, New Jersey, her loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Pearlie Barner of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Dorothy Alston of Atlanta, Georgia, Mrs. Carolyn Colson of Cordele, Georgia, and Mrs. Martha Ruffins of Newark, New Jersey. A beloved brother-in-law, Mr. Benny Colson, a host of nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mrs. Cora Lee Barner Robinson, age 77, of 1108 South 8th Street, Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Olin James Walker, age 66, of 1101 South 13th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, February 1st, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Olin James Walker, age 66, was held Friday, February 12th, graveside at the Pleasant Valley Baptist Church Cemetery in Pinehurst, Georgia. His beloved cousin, the Reverend Eveline Wallace, officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Mrs. Aisha Chisley and her husband, Mr. Greg Chisley of Wake Forest, North Carolina, Mr. Adrian Smith of Cordele, Georgia, and Miss Amber Daniels of West Palm Beach, Florida. 7 loving grandchildren, his beloved and devoted sisters, Mrs. Lavinia Cantrell of Port St. Lucie, Florida, Mrs. Mary Wallace and her husband, Deacon Aaron Wallace of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Ethel Walker of West Palm Beach, Florida, Miss Eula Harvey of River Beach, Florida, Mrs. Dorrance Gaston and her husband, Mr. Tony Gaston of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. Freddie Walker and Mr. Frankie L. Walker, both of West Palm Beach, Florida. A beloved godson, Mr. Jeremy Daniels of West Palm Beach, Florida. A host of nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends, to include his close friends, Mr. Jimmy Passmore, Mr. David Hunter, Mr. Roscoe Wilson, and Mr. Abraham Troutman, all of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Dwight Johnson of Clinton, Maryland, survived. Mr. Olin James Walker, age 66, of 1101 South 13th Street, Cordele, Georgia. United States Army veteran, Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr., age 80, of 214 Halstead Drive, Leesburg, Georgia, died Friday, February 5th at Pruitt Health, Palmyra, in Albany, Georgia. The funeral service for United States Army veteran Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr., age 80, was held Friday, February 12th at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, Portico. The Reverend Isaac H. Owens, pastor of the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Miss Regina Blackman of Belglade, Florida, Mrs. Deetra Davis of Leesburg, Georgia, and Miss Vitra Gaines Woods of Belglades, Florida. 11 beloved grandchildren, 24 great-grandchildren, a beloved sister, Mrs. Dorothy G. Williams of Cordele, Georgia, his beloved brothers, Mr. James T. Gaines and Mr. Harry T. Gaines, both of Cordele, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survived. United States Army veteran, Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr., age 80, of 214 Halstead Drive, Leesburg, Georgia. Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman, age 62, of 608 North 12th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Thursday, February 4th, 2021 at Navison Health in Macon, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman, age 62, was held Saturday, February 13th at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, Portico. His pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, officiated. Burial followed at the Forest Chapel Baptist Church Cemetery in Pinehurst, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Denise Charles Coleman of Cordele, Georgia, his loving and devoted children, Mr. Michael D. Child, Miss Tamika Clark, and her husband, Mr. Robert Clark, and Miss Natasha C. Coleman, all of Cordele, Georgia. 5 loving and devoted grandchildren, his beloved and devoted sisters, Mrs. Janice K. Henderson and Miss Shanika Bryant, both of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved brothers, Mr. Carl Bryant and Mr. Anthony K. Bryant, and his wife, Mrs. Barbara Bryant, both of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved in-law, Mrs. Thelma English and her husband, Mr. Dave English, Miss Shirley Childs, Miss Patricia Green, Mr. Tommy L. Childs, and Miss Karen Anderson, all of Cordele, Georgia. A host of nieces and nephews, many cousins, other relatives, and many sorrowing friends survived. Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman, age 62, of 608 North 12th Street, Cordele, Georgia. Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow of 1112 South 14th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 3rd at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow was held Saturday, February 13th, graveside at the Edgewood Cemetery in Jacksonville, Florida. The Reverend Damian K. Bolden officiated. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Miss Burl Patrick of Cordele, Georgia, and Mr. Kenneth Barlow of Jacksonville, Florida. 6 beloved grandchildren, a host of great-grandchildren, his loving and devoted sister, Mrs. Alma Jones, and Mrs. Martha Chaffer, both of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Mrs. Ethel M. Hilsman and her husband, Mr. Eddie Lee Hilsman of Jacksonville, Florida. His beloved cousin, Deacon Dave Chambliss of Cordele, Georgia. A special caregiver, Ms. April Glenn of Cordele, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survived. Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow of 1112 South 14th Street, Cordele, Georgia. Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson, age 67, of 1107 East 8th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Wednesday, February 3rd, at her residence in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson, age 66, was held Saturday, February 13th, at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Portico. Her pastor, Brother James L. Hughes, pastor of the Hilltop Church of Christ, officiated. The burial followed at the Fort Early Baptist Church Cemetery in Warwick, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted sibling, Mr. Charles Eugene Bagley of Rochester, New York, Mr. Lucius Bagley and his wife, Mrs. Lovey Bagley, Mrs. Cassie Thomas Alexander, Mrs. Loretta R. Brown, and Mr. Milton Holly Jr., all of Cordele, Georgia, Miss Veronica Henny Holly, and Mr. Johnny K. Sutton, both of Atlanta, Georgia, a beloved uncle, Mr. Gentle Lee, a host of nieces and nephews whom she loved and regarded as her own children, many cousins, to include her close cousin, Louise and Marvin of Tampa, Florida, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survived. Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson, age 67, of 1107 East 8th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Beloved gospel musician, Brother Woodrow Wilson Bivens Jr., age 70, of 311 West 22nd Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Monday, February 8th, at the Chris Regional Hospital in Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for beloved gospel musician, Brother Woodrow Wilson Bivens Jr., age 70, was held Saturday, February 13th, at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home Portico in Cordele, Georgia. His pastor, the Reverend Cecil Strawder, pastor of the Gethsemane Baptist Church, officiated. The burial followed at the Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery in Warwick, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Laquita Bivens of Cordele, Georgia. His beloved children, Mr. Jeremy Bivens and Miss Holly Thomas, both of Cordele, Georgia. Mr. Woodrow Edwards and his wife, Mrs. Jasmine Edwards of Sumter, South Carolina. And Mr. Michael Goodman and his wife, Mrs. Lynn Goodman of Warner Robins, Georgia. 5 beloved grandchildren, his loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Catherine Bailey of Cordele, Georgia, Mrs. Helen Zachary and her husband, Mr. Perry Zachary of Albany, Georgia, his beloved brother, Mr. Rufus Bivens and Mr. Dale Bivens, both of Cordele, Georgia, a beloved uncle, Mr. Bigelow Bivens of Baltimore, Maryland, 22 beloved nieces and nephews, a host of cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Beloved gospel musician, Brother Woodrow Wilson Bivens Jr., age 70, of 311 West 22nd Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. Again, the family of Deacon John Henry Hawkins of Rochelle, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Viola Celestine Mathis of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Aldine Holmes of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Menarche Lorenzo Smith Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Miss Cora Lee Barner Robinson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Olin James Walker of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr. of Leesburg, Georgia. The family of Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow of Cordele, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida. The family of Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of beloved gospel musician, Brother Woodrow Wilson Bivens Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. Would like to thank their many friends for all of the many kindnesses shown to them during their hours of sorrow and bereavement during the past week. May God bless each of you is their prayer. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna were in charge of each of these arrangements during the past week. And now, it is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcement. Miss Jacqueline Brown, age 66, of 705 Fitzpatrick Place, Vienna, Georgia, died Saturday, February 6, at the Houston Medical Center in Warner Robins, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted mother, Mother Mattie P. Brown of Vienna, Georgia, her beloved aunt, Mrs. Annie Oliver of Bonaire, Georgia, and Miss Jenny Mae Smith of Doolin, Georgia. Several nieces and nephews to include Miss Dominique Jenkins and her husband, Mr. Mario Jenkins of McDonald, Georgia, Mr. Darian Webb and his wife, Mrs. DeCarlo Webb of Henderson, Nevada, and Mr. Damian Webb and his wife, Mrs. Aretha Webb of Warner Robins, Georgia, a host of other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Miss Jacqueline Brown, age 66, of 505 Fitzpatrick Place, Vienna, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Jacqueline Brown will be held today, Sunday, February 14th at 10 a.m. The service is scheduled to be graveside at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. If weather is inclement and raining at the time, the service will be held at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home portico. Bishop Timothy Boone will officiate. Mrs. Emmy Lee Michael Dew Kellum, age 73, of 1206 South Lake Drive, East Dublin, Georgia, died Monday, February 8th at Landmark Hospital in Savannah, Georgia. Survivors include her loving and devoted son and daughter-in-law, Mr. Alfred and Mrs. B.J. Michael Dew of Dublin, Georgia. Her beloved grandchildren, Miss Shelley Kicklighter and Mr. Bryant Jowers and his wife, Mrs. Cassidy Jowers. Two great-grandchildren, her beloved goddaughters, Mrs. Vera Holmes and Miss Sue Mae Ingram of Fort Pierce, Florida. 5 beloved and devoted sisters, Mrs. Minnie Newby of Tampa, Florida, Mrs. Ida Statham of Thompson, Georgia, Miss Bertha McAdoo, Mrs. Mary Lizzie Brown, and Mrs. Luella McAdoo, all of Rochelle, Georgia. Mrs. Ida Creel and her husband, Mr. Ernest Creel of Atlanta, Georgia. A beloved brother, Mr. Edward McAdoo of Tampa, Florida. Her devoted cousin, Mrs. Gloria Daniels, Mr. Raymond Johnson, both of Rochelle, Georgia. Her loving and devoted friends, Mrs. Barbara Jean Roberts of Rochelle, Georgia, Miss Leslie Ford, Miss Ethel Jones, Miss Maddie Staley, and Mr. Sam Manning of Dublin, Georgia. Miss Francine Ingram of Fort Pierce, Florida, and Miss Yvonne West of Pineview, Georgia. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mrs. Emmy Lee Michael Dew Kellum, age 73, of 1206 South Lake Drive, East Dublin, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Emmy Lee Michael Dew Kellum, age 73, will be held today, Sunday, February 14th at 2 p.m. graveside at the Antioch Baptist Church Cemetery in Pineview, Georgia. The Reverend Connie Graham will officiate. Minister Lanice Graham will deliver the eulogy. Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence, age 37, of 506 South 15th Street, Cordell, Georgia, died Friday, January 29th of injuries sustained in an automobile accident. Survivors include his beloved wife, Mrs. Jorah Lawrence of Cordell, Georgia, his loving and devoted mother, Miss Cynthia Dent of Cordell, Georgia, his beloved children, Mr. Kite Lawrence, Miss Damian Applin, Mr. Jonathan Lawrence Jr., Miss Janaya Lawrence, Miss Alicia Lawrence, and Mr. Nathan Lawrence, all of Cordell, Georgia. His loving and caring sibling, Mr. Demetrius Ashley, Mr. Carlo Lawrence, Mr. Devon Lawrence, and Miss Sterling Dent, all of Cordell, Georgia. A host of aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence, age 37, of 506 South 15th Street, Cordele, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence, age 37, will be held Monday, February 15th at 11 a.m. graveside at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. The walk-up public visitation will be held today, Sunday, from 2 p.m. until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. The infant Eric Messiah Cleveland of 505 East 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Saturday, February 6th at Nevison Health in Macon, Georgia. Survivors include his loving mother, Miss Jacqueline Cleveland of Cordele, Georgia, beloved sisters, Miss Amelia Cleveland, Miss Alea Cleveland, and Miss Adese Cleveland, all of Cordele, Georgia. His grandmother, Miss Patricia Cleveland of Cordele, Georgia. His great-grandmother, Miss Diane Ford of Cordele, Georgia. Aunts, Miss Kimberly Gaston and her husband, Mr. Keon Gaston of Albany, Georgia. Uncle, Mr. John E. Cleveland, Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. His great-aunts and great-uncle, Miss Sheila Smith of Cordele, Georgia. Miss Pamela Gahn and her husband, Mr. Anthony Gahn of Opelika, Alabama. And Mr. Eric Ford Sr. and his wife, Mrs. Pam Ford of Vienna, Georgia. A host of other relatives survived the infant Eric Messiah Cleveland of 505 East 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia. The graveside funeral service for the infant Eric Messiah Cleveland will be held Monday, February 15th at 1 p.m. at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Brother Eddie Sutton of the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses will officiate. Mr. Charlie C. Lester, age 74, of Upper Melbourne, Maryland, died Tuesday, February 2nd at his residence in Maryland. Survivors include his loving and devoted sisters, Mrs. Minnie F. James and her husband, Deacon Oscar James of Byronville, Georgia, Mrs. Sandra K. McKenzie and her husband, Mr. Monty McKenzie of Austell, Georgia, Mrs. Maggie P. Harris of Southborough, North Carolina, Mrs. Ella L. Wicker and her husband, Mr. Willie Wicker of Jacksonville, Florida, Mrs. Joanne L. Sutton and her husband, the Reverend Johnny Sutton of Covington, Georgia, Mrs. Martha J. Lester Harris and her husband, Mr. Sonny Harris of Durham, North Carolina, and Mrs. Frances L. Gardner and her husband, Mr. Clifford Gardner of Vienna, Georgia. A beloved brother, Mr. Robert L. Lester, and his wife, Mrs. Bridget Lester of Germany, and Mr. Thaddeus L. Lester of Lilly, Georgia. A beloved sister-in-law, Mrs. Elaine Lester, his beloved aunt, Mrs. Annie Kate Neal of Jacksonville, Florida. A host of nieces, nephews, cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Charlie C. Lester, age 74, of Upper Melbourne, Maryland. The funeral service for Mr. Charlie C. Lester will be announced at a later date pending the completion of the arrangements. Mr. Joe Louis Mabel, age 84, 84 of 60 Brinson Street, Americus, Georgia, died Monday, February 8th at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Survivors include his loving and devoted children, Miss Linda Mabel, Mrs. Jacqueline Briscoe and her husband, Sir Ryan Briscoe, Miss Joanne Mabel, Mrs. Ellen Johnson and her husband, Mr. Ora Johnson, Mrs. Margaret Watson and her husband, Mr. Lee Watson, Mr. Jeff David Mabel, and Mr. Danny Mabel, all of Wilmington, Delaware. And Mr. Eddie Mabel and his wife, Mrs. Kizzy Mabel of Americus, Georgia. 40 beloved grandchildren, 60 great-grandchildren, 23 great-great-grandchildren, his beloved and devoted sisters and brothers, Mrs. Willie Pearl Bateman and her husband, Mr. Jesse Bateman, Mrs. Georgia Johnson and her husband, Sir Lawrence Johnson, Miss Johnny Lyles, Mrs. Ola Mae Lyles, Mr. Johnny Mabel and his wife, Mrs. Patricia Mabel, Mrs. Patricia Bell and her husband, Mr. David Bell, Mrs. Deborah Ann Clark, and Mr. Sammy Clark, all of Americus, Georgia. Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton and her husband, Mr. James Hamilton of Warner Robins, Georgia, and Mrs. Evelyn Asbury and her husband, Mr. Jimmy Asbury of Ellerville, Georgia. His brother-in-law, Deacon Charles Cooper of Americus, Georgia. His beloved uncle, Mr. George Banks of Americus, Georgia. 49 nieces and nephews, to include a devoted niece, Miss Betty Foster of Americus, Georgia, a very special friend, Miss Agnes Towns of Americus, Georgia, a host of cousins, other relatives, and many, many sorrowing friends survive. Mr. Joe Louis Mabel, age 84, of 60 Brinston Street, Americus, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Joe Louis Mabel, age 84, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams Funeral Directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Friends, that conclude our funeral notices for this morning. And as always, we do remind you concerning our pre-funeral arrangements planning available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home, with packages available with a single pay, a 3-year pay, a 5-year pay, and a 10-year pay. So please stop by and talk with us concerning your pre-funeral arrangements needs available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. And also whole life insurance is available at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. It is certainly with the deepest regret that we make the following announcements. Miss Jacqueline Brown, age 66, of 705 Fitzpatrick Place, Vienna, Georgia, died Saturday, February 6, at the Houston Medical Center in Warner Robins, Georgia. The funeral service for Miss Jacqueline Brown, age 66, will be held today, Sunday, February 14, at 10 a.m. graveside at the Vienna City Cemetery in Vienna, Georgia. Bishop Timothy Boone will officiate. Mrs. Emmy Lee McAdoo Kellum, age 73, of 1206 South Lake Drive, East Dublin, Georgia, died Monday, February 8th at Landmark Hospital in Savannah, Georgia. The funeral service for Mrs. Emmy Lee McAdoo Kellum, age 73, will be held today, Sunday, February 14th at 2 p.m. graveside at the Antioch Baptist Church Cemetery in Pineview, Georgia. The Reverend Connie Graham will officiate. Minister Lenice Graham will deliver the eulogy. Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence, age 37, of 506 South 15th Street, Cordele, Georgia, died Friday, January 29th of injuries sustained in an automobile accident. The funeral service for Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence, age 37, will be held Monday, February 15th at 11 a.m. graveside at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. The public walk-up visitation will be today, Sunday, from 2 p.m. until 5 p.m. at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home. The infant Eric Messiah Cleveland of 505 East 18th Avenue, Cordele, Georgia, died Saturday, February 6th at Navison Health in Macon, Georgia. The graveside funeral service for the infant Eric Messiah Cleveland will be held Monday, February 15th at 1 p.m. at the Bethel Cemetery in Cordele, Georgia. Brother Eddie Sutton of the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses will officiate. Mr. Charlie C. Lester, age 74, Upper Melbourne, Maryland, died Tuesday, February 2nd at his residence. The funeral service for Mr. Charlie C. Lester, age 74, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. Mr. Joe Louis Mabel, age 84, of 60 Brenston Street, Americus, Georgia, died Monday, February 8th at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. The funeral service for Mr. Joe Louis Mabel, age 84, will be announced at a later date, pending the completion of the arrangements. The J.W. Williams funeral directors serving Cordele and Vienna are in charge of each of these arrangements during this week. Our program this morning is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved one was laid to rest during the past week. The family of Deacon John Henry Hawkins of Rochelle, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Claudine Blackburn Burden of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Ms. Viola Celestine Mathis of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mr. Aldine Holmes of Americus, Georgia. The family of Mr. Monarchi Lorenzo Smith Sr. of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Coralie Barner Robinson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Olin James Walker of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Samuel Gaines Jr. of Leesburg, Georgia. The family of Mr. Michael Wayne Coleman of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Deacon Charlie Lorraine Barlow of Cordele, Georgia, and Jacksonville, Florida. The family of Mrs. Geraldine L. Henderson of Cordele, Georgia. The family of beloved gospel musician Brother Woodrow Wilson Bivens Jr. of Cordele, Georgia. This program is dedicated to the bereaved families whose loved ones will be laid to rest during this week. The family of Mrs. Jacqueline Brown of Vienna, Georgia. The family of Mrs. Emmy Lee McAdoo Kellum of East Dublin, Georgia, and Rochelle, Georgia. The family of Mr. Jonathan Danielle Lawrence of Cordele, Georgia. The family of the infant little Eric Messiah Cleveland of Cordele, Georgia. The family of Mr. Charlie C. Lester, Upper Melbourne, Maryland, and Byronville, Georgia. And the family, Mr. Joe Louis Mabel of Americus, Georgia. This election is dedicated to all of the sick and shut-in, to all patients in the local and surrounding hospitals, nursing homes, and rehabilitation centers, to our beloved ministers and their devoted family members, to all retired educators, to the men and women serving in our armed forces, both stateside and abroad, to all veterans, and to everyone who listens to our program on each Sunday morning. It's a pleasure for us to bring it to you. Our program goes out in memory of our past president, Dr. Napoleon Williams, to my wife on this Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's to Calandra Wilkerson Parker, to my son, Jai Wilkerson Parker. Goes out to my mother-in-law, Miss Billy Ann Hall and family, to my brother, retired Chief Master Sergeant Norman F. Dexter, and happy Valentine's Day to his beloved wife, Dr. Gwendolyn Maxine Dexter. And happy Valentine's Day to my sister, Mrs. Maddie Mae Johnson, better known as Sister Girl, and Mrs. Patsy Jackson and her husband, Mr. Jim Jackson of Cordele, Georgia. This election goes out to my nephew, Deacon Kenneth Smith Jr., program chairman of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church. Goes out to our pastor, Dr. K.M. Williams, pastor of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church and moderator of the Gum Creek Missionary Baptist Association. Invite you to worship this morning via conference call and Facebook Live as the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church honor the deacons and deaconess of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church during our annual anniversary celebrated today at the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church. Deacon Tommy Ford, Vice Chairman of Deacon, Mother Lucille Shazer, Church Mother, Sister Mary Henderson, Church Mother, and Sister Cassandra Jackson, Deaconess President, and the entire Deacon Board and Deaconess Board of the Greater Morris Tabernacle Baptist Church. Happy anniversary, and keep up the work and hold up the bloodstained banner of Jesus Christ. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We hope you've enjoyed our program. Tune in again on next Sunday morning. Remember, in your time of need, contact the competent, capable, and dependable staff at the J.W. Williams Funeral Home.